the people. Sahara cover my seas. Sahara.
SaharaTV, you're welcome back. It has almost become cliche, yet an undeniable fact that the politics of Nigeria ultimately affects the politics of the whole Africa as a whole. What does a peaceful, free and fair election in Africa's most populous country mean to the whole continent? We now cross over to seek the informed opinion of Professor Horace Campbell of the Syracuse University. Professor Campbell is also a Pan Africanist, teacher, and a writer. He's the author of several publications, including the famous Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya. He joins us via Skype right now. Thank you, Professor Campbell, for joining us today.
Thank you. And I should add that the Nigerian elections, they are not only important for Africa, but we are saying the global African world. That means it's important for Africans in Venezuela, in Cuba, in the United States, as well as Africans in France, and in Britain and in Germany. Because what happens to Africans in one part of the African world is important to Africans in all parts of the African world.
Definitely, most totally. So to begin this interview formally though, let me ask you, as Nigerians go to the polls, what should they be looking for?
Well, the poll is only one component of a process. This process is the process of the democratization of Nigeria, the process whereby the people of Nigeria progressively have more say in how Nigeria becomes a society where the people will have a good quality of life. So not only should they be campaigning for the respective political parties or governors, but they should also be campaigning for openness, for clarification about how resources are used in the country so that democracy is not simply elections, and the elections does not become a cover for undemocratic practices in the society.
Fantastic, sir. Now, your book, Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya, which we will be getting into a bit more in the course of this interview, is seen by many as a treatise on the operations of the globalists, so to speak. As Nigeria goes into the election faced with all these problems, Boko Haram and all of that, do you smell the hand of these globalists operating in that country?
Yes, but they have a weak hand. They have a weak hand because Nigeria is a very, let me repeat, very strong society. The success of NATO is not limited to the bombing of the people of Libya and the creation of militias and the deployment of forces such as Qatari forces. The success of NATO in its destruction was also related to the demobilization of the people of Libya by Muammar Gaddafi, who kept in power for 42 years. And so the Libyan workers, the Libyan students, the Libyan women did not have room to organize independently of the political leadership under Gaddafi and his family. NATO benefited from that because NATO went into the society, mobilized Islamists, the same people that they were calling terrorists, mobilized them and mobilized those people to overthrow Gaddafi. Now, in the case of Nigeria, they can create nuisances. And of course, there's a big nuisance, such as Boko Haram. But the Nigerian working people, the Nigerian Labor Congress, the Nigerian students, the Nigerian professors, the Nigerian women would never allow a foreign force to come into Nigeria and do what was done in Libya. And the West knows very, very clearly about the possibilities for the Nigerians to lead a new force for political change in Africa. That is why they're using religion and region to divide the people. But people who are true Christians, people who are true Muslims, have not bought into the manipulation of the West, especially countries such as France, Saudi Arabia, and other powers who would like to see Nigeria weakened and would want to hold up the process of the full unification of the African peoples.
That's very informative, sir. Let me quote. Let me give a quote from you and ask you to expatiate a bit on that. Global NATO, you say, is the representative of global capital, and global capital seeks to impact the international political economy through the militarization of the global system. In connection with Nigeria, we've heard about attempts to set up the headquarters of AFRICOM, for instance, which has not come to fruition, possibly through the denial or the prevention of such a move being, carried out by the government. Is this a possibility at all? Is this happening? And then again, moving forward, what real role does Nigeria play in the sub-region in connection with NATO's interests?
Well, the United States Africa Command legitimizes itself in the world that it brings peace and security to African countries. We have seen the footprints of the U.S. Africa Command in Libya. We've seen that after 4 years, after the destruction of Libya, they want to distance themselves from what has happened in Libya. There is no United States military engagement with Africa that can gain legitimacy until the United States have a full accounting for the killing of Patrice Lumumba, a full accounting for the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela, and supporting apartheid and colonialism. So for the Nigerian people, for the people of Africa, the United States military does not have any future in Africa. That is not to say that certain sections of the Nigerian and other African leaders will get trips to the United States under what is called International Military Education Training, IMET, and that the United States will try to sell weapons to Nigeria. But the extent of that will be limited because someone like Nelson Mandela said very clearly when the United States was about to set up Africa Command that the United States Africa Command will have no legitimacy in Africa. Now, the second point about the role of Nigeria. The Nigerians have the most sophisticated intellectual cadre in Africa. In a population of 180 million, we have some of the best writers, artists, media people in Africa. And it is out of that creative group of Nigerians that we have the yearning for peace so that Nigerians can travel in all parts of the country. The Western imperial forces who are now on the defensive because the Western financial crisis means that there's an attempt to super exploit Africa with the rise of alternative sources of finance for Africans in the emerging countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, Vietnam. This has created a crisis for Western imperialism. So it becomes more urgent to find those elements within Nigeria who have stolen so much money from Nigeria that those elements can be manipulated by Western forces, Britain, France, United States, Germany. And so what part of the elections we must be raising up is that the Nigerian people must call for the establishment of the United Nations Stolen Assets Recovery Program, because it's only through instruments such as these that would be led by Nigerians, where the billions of dollars that are being stolen from Nigeria every month would come back into society to create the basis for democracy. And by democracy, we mean the access of Nigerians to food, clothing, shelter, water, and most importantly, electricity. The democratization of access to electricity is one of the most urgent questions, not only for Nigeria, but for the sub-region. Now, in this sub-region, we have a dying power, a dying force in the world called France. France was an ex-colonial power, and it steals the money from 18 African countries who, by force, have to keep their reserves in the French franc. That historic relationship between France and its former colonies is there to prevent the development of the African Monetary Fund and the common currency in Africa. If you remember in my book, Sarkozy said, "We are fighting to save the euro." France led the invasion of Libya so that Gaddafi would not use the $200 billion in reserve of Libya as the basis for the African currency unit. One of the fundamental questions for ECOWAS and Africa is how to ensure that Africa breaks from the US dollar and the euro, and that can only be done by setting up an African currency unit and one currency along with freedom of movement all across Africa. Boko Haram and the nuisance value of French and Western imperial manipulation is to ensure that Nigeria does not focus on those questions.
Interesting. And in connection with what you just said, Prof, let me ask you, do you see, does Nigeria represent a similar threat to the Western forces? I mean, to the West? You just mentioned about Libya and the attempt to set up a single currency for the African Union, which, of course, was a major threat, as you've just so aptly explained. Does Nigeria present anything of such a threat at all to the West?
Of course, Nigeria is the base of one of the largest and most productive sector of the African economy. That is the working people of Africa. The working people of Africa, of which Nigeria have close to 200 million, have the people who create the wealth of Africa. The plan of the African Union is a very straightforward 5-year plan of establishing an African monetary system, an African currency, an African central bank. That would mean that the African currencies would be based on the resources of Africa. In one country alone, like the Congo, we have $24 trillion of reserves of raw material. Nigeria has trillions of dollars. We want freedom of movement of the people, and we want one economy for Africa. This is a threat because France, a small country with no resources, depends on the exploitation of the African peoples. And so those leaders in Nigeria that keep their money in the Swiss bank account, in the British bank account, and in the US bank account, those are the fifth columnists who are undermining African unity. If you remember, when there was a vote in the United Nations over bringing Palestine into the United Nations system, the Secretary of State of the United States called the President of Nigeria half an hour before the vote took place so that Nigeria would switch its vote and would be blackmailed by the United States. Why can the United States blackmail Nigeria? Because the elites in Nigeria have their billions in bank account, and the United States government have this information. 40 years ago, Murtala Mohammed was told by Henry Kissinger to vote with South Africa and the United States against the independence of Africa. Murtala Mohammed told the United States and Henry Kissinger that we are with Africa, we are with the African people in South Africa, and Murtala Mohammed was killed because of that. We know that the military elements in Nigeria who believe in African independence and African unity remember the importance of Murtala Mohammed, and they remember the solidarity of the Nigerian workers with South African workers and Angolan workers. The West attempt to criminalize Nigeria because of the Nigerian criminals who keep their money in the bank accounts in the West. But we know the honest Nigerians want a full unification of Africa.
Yes, sir. Let me throw in a few more questions, even though my time is eaten up. I'd like to really see if I can push a few more. You have dealt with the Libyan example, for instance, very extensively, and one can easily draw parallels between that and what's going on in Nigeria right now. With that in hindsight, would you rush to suggest an interventionist force, an international interventionist force in the Boko Haram crisis?
No. I would rush to clean up the Nigerian political leaders who are financing Boko Haram, expose the neighbors of Nigeria who are colluding with Boko Haram, and after those two things, work with the African Union to clean up Boko Haram. Boko Haram cannot be dealt with militarily. Boko Haram must be dealt with politically, religiously, and militarily. So the political organizing of the Nigerian people, Christians and Muslims, youth and leaders across all sectors of society is a prerequisite for a military campaign against Boko Haram. We have heard today that Boko Haram has now gone to attack Niger. This week, we heard about Chad fighting against Boko Haram. We need to clean up the Nigerian political class and those sections of the military who are colluding with Boko Haram. We read in the media that Wole Soyinka brought out information about how Boko Haram was being financed. That is part of the struggle with Boko Haram. And we will say that France should be kept out of any kind of international military force. Such military force must be under the command of African troops who are not compromised by France in any way.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Before we go, though, could you, in a statement or two, tell us about the state of the Pan Africanist Front? There was a conference that was supposed to come off in Accra, Ghana, which we just had a blackout of information on. What's the state of the Pan Africanist Front?
The state of the Pan African Front is good. As your Sahara listeners know, the last Secretary General of the Pan African Movement was Tajuddin Abdul Rahim. We have him buried there in Funtua, and all Nigerians should know about the contribution of Tajuddin Abdul Rahim and what he did to advance the goals of Pan Africanism. Tajuddin worked tirelessly across Africa, worked in Kenya and in Uganda as a Pan Africanist. Tajuddin was a Yoruba, but he was culturally Hausa, totally Nigeria, and full Pan Africanist. That is the spirit we are carrying into this meeting that will be held in Ghana on the 4th to the 7th of March. And we are urging all young Nigerians, especially Nigerian students, to converge on Ghana to carry forward that spirit. Let me say, from where we sit in the Americas, we are having a fight called Black Lives Matter. Our young Nigerian brothers and sisters would know about the police killings of Michael, of Eric Garner, who said, "I can't breathe." We know of the 100 million Africans who are in Brazil. we have a problem of having enough money to bring our brothers and sisters from Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Jamaica to this meeting. But we're working very hard to ensure that we are full representatives of all sections of the Pan African world, in spite of the limitations, so that the questions that were on the table in 1994 can be carried forward. What are those questions? Number one, that the lives of the African people matter. Number two, that we must have full unification of Africa with one government, one currency, one army. Number three, that we must have peace across the continent of Africa. Number four, we must clean up the African environment. Number five, we must push for reparations for slavery, the slave trade, colonialism, and apartheid. And number six, that the women's liberation movement of Africa must build as a new force for the integrity of women and end all form of extremism and fundamentalism. These are the platforms on which we're going to Accra from the 4th to the 7th so that the Pan-African movement can be carried to the next stage.
Thank you so very much, Professor Horace Campbell, for your time and your insights. And I want to say that the 4th to the 7th of March also coincides with the independence of Ghana. So I definitely want to be there. In the meantime, if you do not have this book, it's one that I would recommend that you get. It's called Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya by Professor Horace Campbell. It's a must read and you must get it. Thank you very much and see you. This is Sahara TV.
Thank you so much.